Folks, it's a momentous day in Hearthstone. Edwin VanCleef confirmed finally getting nerfed. Some people have been waiting 5, 6 years for this one, and it's finally come true. Edwin going to 4 mana. We have a couple other nerfs to talk about in this video. Not too many, but pretty substantial. The ones we're going to discuss, including a hallmark of Hearthstone here with Edwin finally getting nerfed. He's been dodging nerf bullets like Neo for years and years and years. We thought he'd get Hall of Famed multiple times and finally going to 4 mana. And I think this was absolutely a necessary change. It's one I've talked about as a necessary change for years, frankly, because I hate really spiky win rate cards, particularly in the early game. And that's exactly what Edwin did well. Your opponent would play it as a 12-12, and they just win the game on turn 3 by dropping an Edwin. And you never really had a chance because you just didn't have time to develop the answers or resources necessary to answer that Edwin. So what you'd see is with a card like Edwin, it has absurd win rates in the early game. It's like 75% win rates, 65% win rates on turns like 3 and 4. And then, of course, as the game goes on, it becomes far less impactful and its win rate drops. So its average win rate doesn't look necessarily problematic. You look at the deck, it doesn't look like it's too powerful, but you isolate those individual turns, and it's clear that Edwin is ruining somebody's day when he gets played in the early game as that giant Edwin. We've seen some like 22 Edwins on like turn 3 lately, if you follow highlights. So I think finally that broke the back of Blizzard here for nerfing this when they said, okay, it's time. Edwin, your time is done. You're going to 4 mana. And that's clearly going to have a big impact on how likely and how soon people are able to get down in Edwin, because that just gunks up all the numbers in the early game. 4 mana is a lot, even with something like a Foxy Fraud. That means Edwin's still going to cost 2 mana. Even Shadow Stepping it's another 2 mana. So Edwin's a lot harder to get down. And by the time you get it down, one of two things have happened. Your opponent has found answers. They've developed enough stuff on board to just trade into the Edwin. Alternatively, you've kind of taken a turn longer to save up for that Edwin and get all those resources aligned that your opponent is just overwhelming you with stuff and the aggro deck has crushed you or turned the corner hard enough that you can't recover even behind a big Edwin. So by slowing down that initiative, it means Edwin attacks the turn later. Your opponent has another turn for finding answers, and suddenly Edwin becomes a notably weaker card because the whole value in it was getting it down ASAP, and this, slows it down. Cards that were like 7 mana cards that go to 8, maybe it's less important because, you're playing it in the late game anyway. It's still good at 8 mana. Edwin, I think, suffers more from a mana cost nerf than many cards might. So does this mean Edwin is totally dead? Hard to say, right? I think it will definitely hurt, and I think what we'll see is people will test it, they'll find it a little too slow and cut it from decks, but there will still be occasionally lists in the future that bring Edwin back in because they just happen to have enough 0 mana cards or some really crazy tempo and discount opportunities. So I don't think Edwin's necessarily dead forever, but for the short term, I suspect Edwin will definitely be pulled out of play. Rogue's win rate will suffer because they won't have those free wins that Edwin warrants every 1 in 5, 1 in 10 games right now, but they won't be hurt at a just absurd degree. Rogue's not going to fall out of the meta. I think it'll still be a strong card. It just won't steal games from you as often. So moving on to our next nerf, this one's probably more desired or more important to the meta right now. It's Boggspine Knuckles going to 3 attack instead of 4 attack. And that might look like a pretty small nerf at first glance because it's not affecting the speed through the mana cost and it's not affecting the effect at all. It's still retaining its same evolve effect. But the big important aspect for Boggspine Knuckles here is that you can no longer play a Dread Corsair for free the same time you equip the Boggspine Knuckles. It's going to cost 1 mana now instead of 0 mana. So often your opponent will get that kind of free 5-drop or multiple free 5-drops right when they equip the Boggspine because of those Dread Corsairs. Now that swing is stalled out for a turn. They'd have to wait until later to fit in that mana. And that will definitely lower the impact of those first Boggspine boards in many cases. Now, here's the deal. I still think Boggspine is going to be a really strong card because sometimes I don't have the Dread Corsair and I still feel like I get overrun. And it still has 2 durability, so they're going to be able to reload up that next turn, which sure, it gives you another turn to find your Brawl or whatever, but often those evolve boards are just so dominant that you can't recover even with brawls. They just keep coming. And what that means is I think Evolved Shaman remains good and Boggspine Knuckles probably remains rather playable. It's just cutting off the edge or softening the edge a little bit for those really spiky, perfect Dread Corsair scenarios. There are obviously some other small impacts here where this can't trade into things quite as well on board or push as much damage, which definitely adds up. I think that's nice, but that wasn't the real value in the attack of Boggspine Knuckles. It was the Dread Corsair synergies that opened this one up so much. All that said, I think Evolved Shaman will remain a pretty high tier deck and won't lose too much because of this, but I'll take any small percentage hits I can because this is a very frustrating deck to play against. And then finally, one last nerf here, not in standard. This one's over in Battlegrounds. Elistra the Immortal going from a 7/7 to a 4/4. And I'm a little bit surprised here. Elistra's a great Battlegrounds minion. I actually have been playing a lot of Battlegrounds off stream the last week, and it feels like one of the best, or maybe the best minion to just toss into your build. It's kind of a neutral minion that you can pop into anything, and it makes sense because it's just 4 really nice sticky bodies. It's very disruptive to your opponent's game plan, sometimes forcing them to pop divine shields or waste good attacks on this smaller interrupting style minion. And if you look at the data on HS Replay, Elistra really does have a surprisingly high play impact for a neutral minion. Of course, most Battlegrounds minions are neutral, but by neutral, I mean living outside of a natural archetype. She's not a dragon, beast, etc. So she's competitive with things like Amalgadon, which is really the highest play impact neutral style minion you can toss into any given build. And that surprised me. Like, she's really, really good, especially in the mid game where her stats are very competitive as a 7/7. So perhaps Blizzard is just looking to pull down on that kind of generic power level for Elistra a little bit, or prevent her from being as disruptive or meaningful as she is now. What this means when she goes to 4/4 is that essentially she's still really good at disrupting your opponent because she still has the same 4 attack interruptions, the same taunt synergy stuff, but she's not as good as a tempo play on board where she's that like 28 total attack minion across 4 attacks. That was probably just a little too strong in the mid game, better than things like Gascoiler, for instance, at dumping the board, because her summons are just better than the Gascoiler summons in many cases. So I think they just wanted to pull down that power level while retaining the kind of tech and utility of Elistra, making her less of a general use minion. I don't know if that's the insights or the reasons why, but that's my explanation at least. I think it's a fine change. I'm not bothered by this one, but I'm also not a huge Battlegrounds person, so maybe go listen to a Battlegrounds expert and see their take on this one for some additional insights. All that said, that wraps it up here for this here nerf recap. A small number of nerfs, but I think some important ones. Notable with Edwin, impactful to the meta with Boggspine, and a Battlegrounds nerf to toss in here for free as well. So that said, if you have thoughts on these nerfs, you think they should have did something different or nerfed other cards that got missed, of course, share those down in the comments below. But until then, thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.